Anne did not go to Charles first. She did not go to the palace communications team or the private secretaries whose function is to manage exactly the kind of sensitive disclosure she was carrying. She did not reach for any of the institutional channels that exist precisely to handle information of this weight before it reaches the people most directly affected by it. She went to William, directly, personally, without advance notice, and without the careful preparation that surrounds most private communications between senior royals when the subject matter is significant enough to require management before delivery. She went to William because what she had found belonged to him, not institutionally, not constitutionally, but personally and finally, and in a way that Anne had spent enough time sitting with to be completely certain about before she moved. Diana had left something behind. Not a rumor, not a second-hand account, not the kind of thing that travels through families across generations and gets distorted by the distance it covers. Something specific, something documented, something that Anne had discovered in circumstances that she had not anticipated and that had changed. In the hours between discovery and her decision to contact William, everything she had believed she understood about a period of Diana's life that she had thought was already as fully known as it was ever going to be. Camilla realized something was happening before she knew what it was. And by the time she understood, Anne and William were already in the same room. Before you can understand what Anne discovered, and why it sent her directly to William, rather than through any of the institutional channels that exist for exactly this kind of situation, you need to understand something about Anne that the public version of her character consistently undersells. The public version of Princess Anne is accurate as far as it goes. The directness, the discipline, the complete absence of performative sentiment, the record of genuine service that has been sustained across decades with a consistency that puts most people in public life to shame. All of that is real, and all of it is relevant. But what the public version undersells is the specific quality of Anne's relationship with the truth. Not truth in the abstract, philosophical sense, but truth in the practical, documentary, what actually happened sense that matters when families carry complicated histories across generations, and the people inside those families have to decide, continuously and often without adequate information, what they actually know versus what they have assumed or been told or constructed from the fragments available to them. Anne has always been the person in the royal family who wants to know what actually happened, not the managed version, not the institutionally convenient version, not the version that has been smoothed into a shape that protects people or positions or arrangements that the truth in its complete form might complicate. What happened? She has spent her adult life inside an institution that is extraordinarily accomplished at producing managed versions of events and has maintained, across that entire adult life, a consistent and occasionally uncomfortable commitment to the distinction between the managed version and the real one. That commitment is what produced the discovery. Not a deliberate investigation, not a targeted search for something she already suspected existed. The discovery happened in the way that significant things sometimes happen to people whose attention to the real version of events makes them capable of recognizing significance when it presents itself without announcement. Anne had been working through material connected to a private family matter, the kind of administrative work that members of the royal family periodically undertake in relation to the estates, personal effects, and documentary records that accumulate across lives lived inside an institution of historical significance. The material she had been working through was not specifically Diana's. It was connected to a broader category of family documentation from a period that covered the final years of Diana's life and the years immediately following her death. A period that Anne had her own relationship with, her own memories of, her own understanding of in the particular form that people who were present for a significant period understand it. She had been working through the material with the focused efficiency that characterizes everything Anne does, and had been moving through it without anticipating that it would produce anything that required her to stop. What caused her to stop was not immediately dramatic. It was the specific quality of attention that Anne's commitment to the real version of events produces in her when she encounters something that doesn't fit the managed version she already holds. A small inconsistency, a detail that sat slightly wrong relative to her existing understanding, a piece of information that was not alarming in isolation, but which connected to other pieces she already held in a way that created a picture different from the one she had been carrying. She read the relevant section of the material twice. She set it aside. She came back to it an hour later and read it again. And the third reading confirmed what the first two had suggested, that what she was looking at was not an administrative artifact of the period she had been working through, but something that Diana had placed in a specific location, with a specific intention, in a way that suggested Diana had understood it might not be found immediately and had made the decision to document it anyway, with the expectation that it would eventually reach someone who would understand what they were looking at and what it required of them. Diana had always been more deliberate about documentation than the people around her fully appreciated. This is something that the people who knew her most intimately have acknowledged in careful terms across the years since her death. The recognition that Diana's understanding of her own position inside a powerful institution had produced in her a specific awareness of the importance of documented records in an environment where the undocumented version of events was always vulnerable to being replaced by the managed version. She had written letters. She had kept records. She had documented conversations and decisions and circumstances in ways that went significantly beyond the personal correspondence that has become publicly known. Anne understood this about Diana. She had always understood it, in the way that two women who had both spent their lives inside the same powerful institution and developed their own strategies for navigating it, understand each other's approaches without requiring explicit discussion. And holding the material she had just found, Anne understood immediately that what Diana had documented in this specific instance was something she had understood as significant enough to preserve in a form that would survive the immediate period of its creation and be available to the right person at a future moment Diana could not precisely predict. The content of what Diana had documented connected to a period and a set of circumstances that Anne had her own understanding of, an understanding that she had held for years in the partial form that comes from being adjacent to events rather than fully inside them. Diana had been navigating something specific during the period the documentation covered, something that had involved specific people, specific decisions, and specific consequences that had shaped the trajectory of Diana's life in the period the documentation addressed. Anne had known some of this from her own observation and from the things that people close to Diana had told her across the years. But the documentation gave her something her existing understanding had lacked: the specific detail, the documented evidence, the precise record of what Diana had known and when she had known it, and what she had understood about the implications of what she was living through at the time she was living through it. The documentation was not a journal in the conventional sense. It was something more specific than that, a record of particular conversations, particular decisions, particular moments that Diana had understood as significant enough to write down with a precision that went beyond the kind of emotional processing that personal diaries typically represent. Diana had been documenting facts, specific, verifiable, consequential facts about a set of circumstances that had been managed in the official and unofficial histories of her life in a way that the documentation, read now, revealed as significantly incomplete. Anne sat with the documentation for a long time after the third reading confirmed what she was looking at. This is not characteristic of how Anne typically operates. She is a person who processes quickly and acts on her processing with a directness and a speed that the people around her have learned to anticipate. The length of time she spent sitting with the documentation before she did anything told her something about herself that she has since described to the very small number of people she has spoken to about this period, that the documentation had produced in her a response that required more time than her normal processing speed could accommodate. Not because she was uncertain about what she was looking at or uncertain about what it required of her. She was certain about both from the third reading onward. The time she needed was for something else, for sitting with the specific weight of having found something that Diana had placed in the world with the intention that it would eventually reach the right person, and understanding that she was the person who had found it, and that the responsibility of what to do with it was now hers in a way that could not be delegated or managed or placed in someone else's hands without first making a decision about where it needed to go. The decision about where the documentation needed to go was not complicated in the sense of being unclear. It was complicated in the sense of being consequential, of requiring Anne to act in a way that she understood would produce responses from people inside the institution that she was prepared for but had not been looking for. Diana had documented something that connected to circumstances involving specific people who were still alive and still present in the institutional environment of the monarchy. Taking the documentation to William, the person Anne had concluded Diana had most intended to reach with what it contained, would initiate a process whose direction Anne could shape initially, but could not fully control once it was in motion. She had thought about this carefully, across the hours between finding the documentation and making the decision to contact William. She had considered whether there was a version of her responsibility toward what Diana had left behind that could be discharged more quietly, with less institutional disruption, in a way that got the documentation to William without setting in motion the full weight of what its contents might produce when William understood them completely. She had concluded that there was not. Diana had not documented what she had documented quietly. She had documented it with the specific precision of someone who understood that what they were recording was important enough to require a complete and honest record rather than a managed and protected one. Anne was not going to honor that intention by delivering the documentation through a channel that replicated exactly the kind of management Diana had been working against when she created it. Anne contacted William through a channel that bypassed the layers of household coordination that typically surround private communications between senior royals when the subject matter is institutionally sensitive. She did not send a message that described what she had found. She said only that she needed to see him in person, privately, and that it concerned something connected to Diana that he needed to receive directly from her rather than through any other channel. William had received communications from Anne before that carried a similar quality of stripped-down directness, communications that signaled by their very economy that what was being requested was significant, and that the significance was not something to be managed in advance of the meeting, but to be encountered in it. He had responded to those communications with the same directness Anne had brought to sending them, and he responded to this one the same way. The meeting was arranged within 24 hours. The location was chosen by Anne, a private setting that she specified with the particular care of someone who understood that what was going to be discussed in it required conditions that the usual environments of royal private meetings did not always guarantee. No household staff beyond the minimum necessary for security. No pre-meeting briefings. No institutional management of any kind around the conversation that was about to happen. William arrived at the meeting carrying the specific quality of readiness that Anne's communication had produced in him. The readiness of someone who has understood from a stripped-down message that what is coming is significant, and has prepared themselves not with information, which was not available, but with attention. He was ready to receive whatever Anne had found with the full force of his comprehension and his feeling simultaneously engaged. Anne had the documentation with her. She did not hand it to William immediately. She told him first, in the direct, unmanaged way that is Anne's only register when the substance of a communication is what matters, what she had found, where she had found it, and what she understood Diana to have intended by placing it where she had placed it, in the form she had placed it in. She told him that what the documentation contained was going to require him to revise his understanding of a specific period of his mother's life, that it was going to name specific people and specific decisions and specific consequences that he had not had access to in their complete documented form before, and that she had brought it to him rather than to anyone else, because Diana's intention in creating it had been, as Anne understood it with the clarity of someone who had read it 3 times and sat with it for hours, directed toward exactly this, toward William receiving a complete and honest record of something Diana had understood, while she was living through it, that her son deserved to know. William took the documentation from Anne's hands with the specific, careful deliberateness of someone who understands that what they are holding is not simply paper. He began to read. And Anne, watching her nephew's face as he moved through what Diana had recorded with the precision and the intention of someone who had understood that the truth she was documenting might not reach him immediately, but had trusted that it would eventually reach him completely, understood that the hours she had spent sitting with the question of where the documentation needed to go had produced the right answer. But what Anne had not yet told William, what she had decided needed to wait until he had read the documentation completely and held its contents in the full context of everything it revealed, was the final element of what she had discovered. The element that explained not simply what Diana had documented, but why the specific location in which Anne had found it told her something about how Diana had understood the risk that what she was recording might not survive in the form she intended. Because Diana had not simply documented something and left it where it was. She had hidden it, deliberately, carefully, in a location that suggested she had understood that the people most motivated to ensure it never reached William were people who had access to the environments where it would most naturally have been kept. And that understanding, that Diana had hidden the documentation from specific people with specific access, meant that the question of how Anne had found it was inseparable from the question of who Diana had been hiding it from. William finished reading the documentation without speaking. Anne had expected this, had known from the moment she decided to bring it to him that his first reading would happen in complete silence, that the quality of attention he brings to things that genuinely matter to him would require the full period of reading to be uninterrupted by anything, including whatever Anne herself might have been inclined to say in the space that a less disciplined observer might have felt compelled to fill. She had sat across from him with the particular patience of someone who has already spent hours with the thing being read, and understands that the person encountering it for the first time needs to encounter it completely before anything that follows it can be received with the context it requires. William read slowly. Not because the documentation was difficult to understand. Diana had written it with the specific clarity of someone who wanted to be understood precisely, rather than interpreted generously, but because William was reading the way people read things that require their entire comprehension rather than simply their attention. He was reading with everything, with his knowledge of the period, with his memory of his mother during the specific circumstances the documentation described, with his understanding of the people named in it and his existing relationship with those people, and the specific way that relationship would now be required to accommodate what the documentation revealed about what those people had known and decided and done during a period that William had understood through a different and significantly less complete lens than the one Diana's documentation now provided. When he reached the final page, he held it for a moment without looking up. Anne did not speak. She allowed the silence to exist with the same patience she had brought to the full reading, understanding that the silence following the completion of the documentation was itself part of William's reception of it, the specific quiet of someone who has just arrived at the end of something that has changed the shape of a significant portion of what they understood about the past. When William finally raised his eyes from the page, he did not look at Anne immediately. He looked at the middle distance, in the way that people look when they are not seeing the room they are in, but the room they have just been taken to by what they have read. The the specific unfocused focus of someone whose comprehension has arrived at a place that is still being fully assembled. Then he looked at Anne, and Anne, receiving his look, understood that he had comprehended it completely. Not partially, not with the areas of uncertainty that sometimes follow from a first reading of something complex. Completely. Diana had written clearly, and William had understood clearly, and the comprehension sitting between them now in that room was the same comprehension without the gap that different understandings of the same material can create. William asked Anne one question before he said anything about the documentation's content. He asked how she had found it. Not where. She had told him that in the account she had given before he read. He asked how, in the specific sense of what had led her to the particular material she had been working through when the documentation surfaced, what had made her the person in the right place at the right time to encounter what Diana had left in the location she had chosen to leave it. Anne answered precisely because the answer was relevant in a way that went beyond simple curiosity about the discovery's circumstances. The how of the finding told something important about the why of the hiding, about Diana's reasoning in choosing the specific location, the specific form, the specific conditions that had made it available to Anne in this particular moment, rather than to someone else at an earlier one. Anne explained the administrative work she had been conducting, the specific category of material it had covered, the way the documentation had presented itself within that material, not as something immediately flagged as significant, but as something that had revealed its significance through the quality of attention Anne had brought to the work, rather than through any obvious external indication of its importance. Diana had not hidden the documentation in a way that announced itself as hidden. She had placed it in a location where it would be encountered only by someone doing the specific kind of careful work that Anne had been doing, someone sufficiently close to the family's private documentary history to be working through the relevant material, and sufficiently committed to the real version of things to recognize significance when it presented itself without drama. That answer produced something in William's expression that Anne has since described as the moment she understood how fully he had received what Diana had intended by the hiding itself. Because the hiding was not simply a precaution against the documentation being found by the wrong person. It was a communication. Diana had understood that the location she chose and the form she gave the documentation would determine not just whether it survived, but who would find it, and under what circumstances, and she had made those choices with the deliberateness of someone who understood that the conditions of the finding would be as meaningful as the content of what was found. The documentation had not surfaced randomly. It had surfaced because Anne had been doing the kind of careful, honest work with the family's private records that Diana had apparently understood someone would eventually do, and had trusted that when that person encountered what she had left, they would understand both what it contained and what the conditions of its finding said about who Diana had been protecting it from. William said Diana's name quietly before he asked his second question, not as an address, not as an exclamation, not in any of the ways that people use the names of the dead when strong emotion requires an outlet. He said it in the specific way that people say the name of someone they loved when they have just received evidence of that person's intelligence and care and forethought operating across time toward them. The way you say a name when what you mean by it is that the person it belongs to understood something important and acted on that understanding in a way that has just, finally, reached you. Anne had heard William say his mother's name before, in various contexts across the years of their relationship. She had not heard him say it in quite that way. It told her something about where he was sitting with the documentation that none of the external evidence of his reception, the careful reading, the subsequent silence, the questions, had told her as directly. He was sitting with it as his mother's son. Not as the future king, not as the senior royal whose institutional position gave the documentation's implications a particular weight in the context of the people it named and the circumstances it described. As her son. receiving something she had left him across time, with the specific intention that he would eventually have it. That reception was the most important thing happening in the room, and Anne understood it as such, and let it be what it was, without interrupting it with anything institutional or strategic or forward-facing, before William was ready to move there himself. The second question William asked was about Camilla. Not because Camilla was named in the documentation in a way that made her its primary subject. She was not, and Anne had been careful in her account before the reading to ensure that William understood the documentation's primary focus before he encountered it. But because the circumstances the documentation described and the people it named connected to a set of institutional dynamics that Camilla occupied a specific position within, and William had understood from the reading that what Diana had documented was not separable from those dynamics in a way that allowed Camilla's position within them to remain unaddressed. He asked Anne whether Camilla knew the documentation existed. Anne said she did not believe so. She had found no indication in the circumstances surrounding the documentation's hiding that Diana had anticipated Camilla knowing about it. Quite the reverse. The specific location Diana had chosen, the specific form she had given the documentation, and the specific conditions under which it had remained undiscovered for the period between Diana creating it and Anne finding it, were all consistent with Diana having understood that its survival depended on Camilla not being aware of its existence. William received this without visible reaction. He set the documentation on the surface beside him with the same careful deliberateness he had used when Anne first handed it to him. Then he asked the question that Anne had been anticipating since before the meeting had begun. The question that told her his processing had moved from reception into the territory where what he had received was being organized into something he could act on. He asked Anne what she believed Diana had intended to happen when the documentation finally reached someone who understood what it contained and what it required. Anne had sat with this question across the hours between finding the documentation and contacting William, and had arrived at an answer she was confident in, not because it was simple, but because the documentation itself, read with the attention to Diana's specific intentions that Anne had brought to it, made it clear. Diana had not created the documentation as an instrument of exposure or retaliation or any of the motivations that people who discover sensitive historical records sometimes attribute to those who created them. She had created it as a record. A complete, honest, precisely documented record of something that had happened. Something that the official and unofficial histories of the relevant period had allowed to remain incompletely recorded in ways that served the interests of the people most motivated to keep the record incomplete. Diana had understood that incomplete records create conditions in which incomplete understandings persist, and that the people who carried those incomplete understandings, including and especially William, deserved to have the complete version available to them when the time was right for them to have it. Anne believed Diana's intention had been exactly and only that, not what William did with the complete understanding once he had it. That had been left to William. Diana had trusted her son to know what to do with the truth when it finally reached him. Anne said this to William in the same direct terms in which she believed it, without softening or qualifying it in a way that would have introduced ambiguity Diana had not intended. William sat with that for a moment. Then he said something that completed the circle of the meeting's most significant exchange. The thing that told Anne her decision to bring the documentation directly to him had been correct not simply in the sense of honoring Diana's intention, but in the sense of honoring William's capacity to receive it in the spirit it had been created. He said his mother had understood something about him that he had not always understood about himself, that the truth, received completely and honestly and without the management that the institution typically places around sensitive historical information, was something he could carry without being destroyed by it. That Diana had trusted him with the complete version rather than a protected partial version was itself the most significant thing about the documentation. More significant than any specific detail it contained, more significant than any of the implications it carried for his understanding of the period it described or the people it named. The trust was the most important thing, and William said he intended to honor it in the same spirit Diana had extended it, by receiving the complete version without flinching and deciding what it required of him with the same honesty Diana had brought to creating it. Anne had one more thing to tell him, the final element she had held back across the full length of the meeting, held back not to manage his reception of the documentation, but because it required everything that had preceded it to be in place before it could be received with the context it required. She told William that the documentation was not the only thing Diana had left in the location where Anne had found it. There had been something else, something that had been placed alongside the documentation in a way that made clear they were intended to be found together, that the second thing was not separable from the first in Diana's intention, but was the completion of it, something that Anne had not described in her account before the reading, because she had concluded that William needed to receive the documentation first and completely before the second thing could mean what Diana had intended it to mean. She placed it on the surface beside the documentation, and William, looking at what Anne had placed before him, understood immediately what it was, and why Diana had left it alongside the documentation, and why Anne had been right to save it until this moment. It was a letter, written in Diana's hand, addressed not to William by name, but in terms that made its intended recipient unmistakably clear to the person reading it. A letter that Diana had written after creating the documentation, after making the precise, factual record of what had happened, and that functioned in relation to the documentation the way that human warmth functions in relation to documentary fact. The documentation was the truth. The letter was Diana telling William what she wanted him to do with the truth once he had it. Not instructions, not demands, not the kind of directive that closes down the person receiving it into a prescribed course of action. Diana telling her son, in the specific voice that the people who knew her well have always described as her most essential quality, warm, direct, completely without performance, what she hoped the truth would give him, what she believed having the complete version would make possible that the incomplete version had been preventing, what she trusted him to build from the complete understanding, once it was finally in his possession. William read the letter with the same completeness he had brought to the documentation. When he finished, he did not set it aside with the careful deliberateness he had used for the documentation. He held it, and Anne, watching him hold his mother's final words in the specific way that a person holds something irreplaceable, understood that what Diana had hidden in that location had not simply been documentation of the past. It had been a message aimed at this exact moment, at William sitting in a private room with the complete truth in one hand and his mother's voice in the other, finally in possession of everything Diana had believed he needed to understand what had happened and what came next. But the question that neither the documentation nor the letter had yet answered, the question that was forming in the room now with the particular weight of something whose answer would determine everything that followed, was who else Diana had known about when she created the documentation, who else she had understood was aware of what it recorded, and whether that person, still present in the institutional environment surrounding William's family, understood that what Diana had hidden had just been found. William set the letter down with a care that Anne recognized as something beyond the careful handling of an important document. It was the specific gentleness of someone placing a thing they love in a position where it will be safe while they turn their attention to what it has asked them to do. Diana had written toward action in that letter, not the confrontational, exposing, institutionally disruptive kind of action that the documentation's content might have seemed to demand as its natural response, but something more considered and more durable than that. She had written toward understanding used purposefully, toward the complete picture deployed not as a weapon against the people the documentation named, but as a foundation for the kind of clarity that allows a person to navigate the environment around them with eyes fully open, rather than with the partial vision that incomplete information inevitably produces. William had understood this from the letter. He had understood it with the specific comprehension of a son receiving his mother's most carefully considered wishes, not as instructions that constrained him, but as a framework that trusted him. Diana had not told William what to do. She had given him what he needed to decide for himself what to do. And that distinction, which Diana had apparently understood, was the most important thing about how the documentation and the letter together needed to function, was the distinction that was now shaping how William was organizing his response to everything Anne had placed before him. He asked Anne one final question, before either of them addressed the question of what came next in any practical sense. He asked whether she had told anyone else about the finding before coming to him. The question was precise and specific, and the answer mattered in a way that went beyond simple curiosity about who else was in possession of the information. It mattered because the answer determined the conditions under which William could respond to what the documentation contained, whether those conditions were ones he could shape or ones that had already been partially shaped by other people's awareness of what had been found. Anne said no. She had told no one. She had found the documentation, sat with it, made the decision to bring it to William, and come to him without passing through any intermediary channel or sharing what she had found with any other person in the period between the finding and this meeting. The answer was unambiguous, and Anne delivered it with the directness that is her most consistent characteristic. Not the directness of someone establishing a position, but the directness of someone stating a fact that needs no elaboration because it is simply true. William received it with a brief nod that said more than any verbal response would have said. Anne had given him something extraordinarily valuable in that answer. She had given him time, the specific form of institutional time that exists in the gap between information being found and information being known to be found, the period during which the person who holds the information can determine the conditions of its use rather than responding to conditions determined by others. William understood the value of what Anne had given him with the specific comprehension of someone who has spent his adult life inside an institution where information and the conditions of its emergence are among the most consequential forces operating at any given moment. He did not immediately begin describing what he intended to do with the time Anne had preserved for him. He asked instead about the documentation's physical security, whether it was in the condition Anne had found it in, whether it had been handled in ways that might affect its status as a documentary record, whether the location where Anne had found it remained accessible to the people who had access to it before the finding. Anne answered each element with the precision of someone who had thought about exactly these questions in the hours between finding the documentation and contacting William, because Anne's commitment to doing things properly extended to doing them properly from the moment of discovery rather than only in retrospect. The documentation was intact. Its handling had been careful. The location remained as it had been, with nothing indicating to anyone with access to it that the documentation had been found and removed. William had a complete and undisturbed record of something Diana had created with the intention that it survive and eventually reach him. He had it in conditions that allowed him to decide how and when and in what context it became the basis for whatever came next. The conversation about what came next happened in the specific register that characterizes the most serious exchanges between William and Anne, stripped of social padding, free from the kind of institutional language that tends to accumulate around sensitive discussions within the royal family when the people having them are aware that their words might need to be characterized to others afterward. William and Anne, speaking privately, with no record being made and no institutional management around the conversation, communicate in a way that the people who have observed them in less private settings rarely see, directly. Economically, with the mutual understanding of two people who respect each other's intelligence enough not to explain things that the other person has already understood, and not to qualify things that don't require qualification. William said what he was thinking, and Anne responded to what he was thinking rather than to a managed version of it, and the conversation moved quickly through territory that a more formally structured discussion would have taken significantly longer to cover. What William said about Camilla in the context of what came next reflected the specific quality of his reception of the documentation, the quality that Diana had apparently anticipated and designed both the documentation and the letter to produce. He did not speak about Camilla with the anger that the documentation's content might have been expected to generate as an immediate response from a son who has just received evidence of something connected to his mother's life that Camilla's position was implicated in. He spoke about her with the particular clarity of someone who has received a complete picture and is now seeing a person they have known for years through the lens of that complete picture for the first time, not with new hostility, but with new accuracy. There is a difference between those two things, and William understood the difference and was operating from it in the way he addressed what the documentation revealed about Camilla's awareness of the circumstances it described and the decisions that had been made within those circumstances. He was not going to approach Camilla with the documentation as an instrument of confrontation. He was going to approach her, and this was the thing Diana had apparently understood and written the letter to prepare him for, with the complete understanding as a foundation for a conversation that needed to happen between them, in a way that no previous conversation had been able to happen, because no previous conversation had been possible on the basis of complete mutual information. Diana had not left the documentation so that William could wound Camilla with it. She had left it so that William could finally speak to Camilla from a position of knowing what he was actually speaking about. Anne had listened to this with the specific quality of attention she brings to things that revise her understanding of someone in a positive direction, a quality of attention that is rarer in Anne than people assume, because she is not easily revised in her assessments of people once those assessments have been formed across sufficient evidence. What William's articulation of his intended approach to Camilla produced in Anne was a revision of a kind, not of her assessment of William, which had always been high, but of her understanding of how fully he had received what Diana had intended by both the documentation and the letter. Diana had not simply left her son evidence of something that had happened. She had left him a framework for responding to it in a way that was worthy of the love and the clarity she had brought to creating it. And William, in describing his intended approach to Camilla, had demonstrated that he had received that framework completely. Anne said so directly, without elaboration, without the kind of warm qualification that less direct people add to acknowledgments of this kind. She said he had understood what Diana had intended, and that was the most significant thing she could have said to him in that moment, and both of them understood it as such. The question of the palace, of the institutional response to what was going to begin moving when William acted on what he had received, was something both Anne and William addressed with the shared understanding of two people who have each spent their entire lives inside the institution and understand its dynamics with the comprehensive accuracy of long experience. The palace would not know immediately. That was the condition Anne had preserved by coming directly to William without passing through any institutional channel. But the palace would know eventually, would become aware that something was in motion, that William and Anne had met privately with a specific purpose that had produced a specific direction, that the institutional equilibrium that had been maintained around certain historical circumstances connected to Diana was in the process of being altered by the person who had the most personal standing to alter it. Camilla would understand this before most of the palace did. She would understand it not from being told, William had not yet spoken to her, but from the specific awareness that people who have been managing sensitive historical information across an extended period develop about the conditions under which that information's management is no longer fully secure. Something would shift. She would feel the shift before she understood its source, and the period between that feeling and her understanding of its source was the period in which William intended to be ready for the conversation that Diana's documentation had made finally and completely possible. Anne's role in what followed was something they discussed in the final portion of the meeting, with the same directness that had characterized its entirety. She was not going to be positioned as a co-actor in whatever William did next. That was William's to do, in his time and his way, from the foundation of what Diana had left him. But she was also not going to return to the position of someone who had found something significant and handed it off and stepped back into the normal operation of her life as though nothing had changed. Something had changed. The finding had changed it for Anne in the specific way that things change when you discover that a belief you have held for years about what you know has been revealed as incomplete by something you have just encountered. Anne's understanding of the period the documentation covered, her understanding of Diana's experience during that period, of the specific circumstances and decisions and people the documentation described, was now a complete understanding rather than the partial one she had been carrying. That completeness had obligations that she was not going to set aside simply because the primary action that the documentation required belonged to William rather than to her. She would be available. She would be present in whatever form William determined was most useful. And she would continue to be the person Diana had apparently trusted to find what she had hidden, the person whose commitment to the real version of things made her the right custodian of the complete picture in the period between its discovery and its purposeful use. William stood to leave with the documentation and the letters secured in a way that reflected his understanding of their significance and their fragility. Not fragile in the physical sense, but fragile in the sense that all important things are fragile when the wrong people become aware of them before the right conditions for their use have been established. He paused at the door in the way that people pause when they have finished something significant and are standing at the threshold between the room where it happened and whatever comes next. He turned back to Anne. He said something that Anne has kept private in its specific wording, but which she has described in terms that suggest it completed something, that it was the kind of thing said between two people at the end of a meeting that has changed the conditions of everything that follows it, the kind of thing that doesn't need to be elaborate because its meaning is already fully present in the situation that produced it. Anne received it with a nod that meant the same thing his words had meant. Then William left, and Anne sat alone in the room for a moment, with the understanding that Diana had placed something in the world years ago, with the trust that the right people would eventually find it and know what to do with it, and that the right people had found it, and that what Diana had trusted was in exactly the hands she had always intended it to reach. The palace was quiet. Camilla did not yet know. The documentation existed in William's possession in the complete and undisturbed form Diana had created it in. And somewhere in the institutional history of the monarchy, in the specific period Diana had documented with the precision and the honesty of someone who had understood that the truth she was recording deserved to survive in its complete form, something that had been managed into incompleteness for years was about to become complete. Not loudly. Not through exposure or confrontation or any of the dramatic mechanisms that institutional revelations typically move through. Through William walking toward a conversation that Diana had always believed needed to happen, carrying the complete picture his mother had preserved for him, ready at last to speak from the foundation of knowing everything, and to build from that foundation something that the incomplete version had never made possible.